So a chickadee that weighs as much as a few pennies takes 6,000 caterpillars. You can imagine that all the other birds that we want and we want to encourage also take huge amounts of caterpillars. And in order to have those, we have to have hosts. We have to have the plants that support all of those different kinds of species. And so planting native plants and planting a huge variety of native plants is incredibly important, because if you have a bad year for milkweed, for example, you're not going to have monarch butterflies, but you might have another species. So making sure that we are supporting the widest variety of native plant species so that we're able to encourage the widest variety of native insect species makes a resilient ecosystem and makes it so that we're more likely to actually be able to produce the great abundance and diversity of life that we have. Of course, diversity is incredibly important, and we know that fundamentally, right? The diversity of animal and plant life that is on the earth is what we're dependent on. So if we fail to have really diverse ecosystems, we fail to have life. As soon as you can't replace a species once it's gone. And so making sure that we are providing for those species, I think, is really fundamental. And it's not that hard to have a lot of diversity in a garden or in a small area. You can spend a short amount of time putting in a lot of different natives. So while all native plants have specific relationships, specialized relationships with different insects, some families of plants have more relationships with more species. So like oak trees are host plants to an incredible amount of caterpillars. The focus on caterpillars is because caterpillars are the main food source of a lot of birds. The reason they're the main food source is because they're soft-shelled. They don't have to digest all the chitin like you would with beetles. They're very nutrient dense, and they have a lot of micronutrients in them from eating plants that are necessary during that growth cycle. So oaks are really ubiquitous, and so they are a really good food source for a lot of different things, because once a species develops a capacity to eat one kind of oak, they might be able to develop a capacity to eat an entire range. So sometimes the specialization of a plant or of an insect isn't a specific plant, but rather a plant family. And so oak families, partially I think because they're so ubiquitous, have created over millennia huge amounts of relationships with different species. And so there's just a lot of diversity that can live on an oak tree. And when you compare that to non-native plants like a ginkgo tree or Bradford pear, I don't know if you guys have seen Bradford pears, but they're ubiquitous. I hate Bradford pears, but if you compare them to a Bradford pears host almost nothing. And so we're wasting all of this all of this space, all of these this capacity for ecological diversity by planting these non-native species. Bradford pears are really common in landscaping, and they become invasive really quickly. In fact, a lot of the plants that have become really invasive were ones that were used in landscaping. It's estimated that 30% of most native lands, like when we're thinking about like national parks and places like that, are covered with invasive species that came out of our manicured lawns and our manicured spaces. They are Asian and European species that, while beautiful, don't provide food sources for anything that other than other invasive species from those same places. And so making sure that we're encouraging a native species versus a non-native species also reduces the chance that we're going to create another invasive. In the prairie ecosystem, we're also thinking about things that live in the roots. We're talking about beetles. We're talking about a variety of spiders and other, and then different insects that are going to live in the soil, because it's not just birds that feed off of insects. Like foxes feed off of insects. Red foxes, it's something like 25% of their diet is insects. Insects have a huge amount of protein per individual insect. The amount of protein that they provide is just incredibly abundant. So yeah, native grass and forb species are super important for those insects. It's not just, but trees are particularly good for caterpillars, which is that bird component. And there are that focus on native forb species, I think is really important because a lot of forb species we think of as weeds. My godfather is a landscaper. He's a horticulturalist at up in Chicago, and he works for actually he's retired now, but for a long time he worked for a native plant focused landscaping group. And while they did have some trees in their landscaping, most of what they wanted to plant was forbs. But it's not just that you want to plant native species, but you want to plant a variety and a diversity. So you can have really great ecosystem dynamics with combining both native and non-native species, but once you get past 17% non-native species, you start to see pretty drastic declines in the interdependency. So you can have non-native species, but we need to make sure that we're really encouraging those native species.